Thank you all for attending, and thanks, Dan, for the introduction. Before we dive into the meat of today, which I'm really excited about, I want to give a brief overview of what IRIS is and does for those of you who may not be familiar with us. So IRIS is the Institute for Research on Innovation and Science, is formally an IRB-approved data repository housed in the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. That data repository serves as the anchor for a consortium of universities who share information, data drawn from their administrative data systems, usually HR sponsored projects and procurement, about the micro details of research spending, internal and external source research spending on their campuses. Those data are submitted to IRIS through a secure system. We clean them, integrate them, connect them to, as an improvement, I think right now it's more than 50 different sources of information, ranging from information about the career outcomes of individuals to the economic performance of vendors who provide goods and services in support of research. We use those data for two purposes. The first is we build a series of, currently 9, data products that return to our participating universities. Nancy's just put a link to some examples on our website in the chat if you want to take a look at them. These are used for a wide range of activities by universities, everything from research development and faculty development planning through government relations at the state and federal level and communications. We also, because we're fundamentally a research organization, de-identify the data, document it, and make it available for research use through a virtual data enclave housed here. So researchers can come in who are interested in higher education, research, science policy, innovation, any one of a number of topics, economic development, and under a DUA have access to protected, documented, de-identified research data that it would be very hard for them to get alone. So the idea here is that IRIS and the universities that participate in it are building and sustaining together an infrastructure for better understanding, explaining, and hopefully improving the public value of investments in higher education and research. And so we're here today because I'm really, really excited to announce, even though we've announced it before, that the newest member of the IRIS family is UC Riverside. And UC Riverside is distinguished for us by being the first institution that is joining us that is a minority serving institution, a Hispanic serving institution in particular. And so one of the things that we are striving to do with IRIS is to expand the reach of the data to better represent the full range of higher education institutions and institutions that are doing research and training researchers. And so in that vein, I wanted to welcome Rodolfo and thank him once again for joining us to talk a little bit about his thinking from the vantage point of his office at Riverside and from his long experience with IRIS back from the time when he was in a similar role at the University of Kansas. And then the idea will be, we'll talk a little bit about why an institution, Riverside, decided to join the initiative. We'll come back and talk a little bit about some of the benefits of potentially aggregating data from many such institutions in order to tell data-driven stories about impact and what these institutions do that's great for society. And then I think we'll throw it open to conversation. Does that seem good to everyone? All right, Rodolfo, thank you very much. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Jason, for the opportunity to show here in this webinar, and great to see your team too, with whom I have been in touch before. And as you mentioned, I used to be in an institution, the University of Kansas, where that is still is, I believe, a member of IRIS, and then I moved to Riverside. So let me put in a little bit in context my relationship with IRIS, and then why we showing now IRIS from UC Riverside. So I was for several years in research administration at the University of Kansas, and I think we were there one of the earliest institution to join IRIS beyond the Big Ten, right? That where essentially this started. We were heavily involved and very engaged with the STAR metric effort at NSF. And in fact, we were kind of disappointed with that was kind of discontinued. And so I first learned about IRIS attending some FDP meeting. One of the many presentations Jason had been given at professional organization, and it's, oh, this is a great idea, and we should be part of that. So we were very involved. As Jason said, I became part of the board. That was a great opportunity to learn more about IRIS. We use the information that IRIS, the report that IRIS can provide in a very successful way to communicate, particularly with legislators, with elected officials both at the state and federal level, when we are trying to showcase the importance and the impact that research, especially federal funded research, has on economic development on the community that we serve. So fast forward, I moved to the University of California, Riverside, which, as many of you in attendance may know, is one of the 10 campuses of the University of California. We are located inland in what we call the Inland Empire. I know not everybody know. I didn't know 2 years ago when I joined what was the Inland Empire really. I learned about the time I was becoming interested in the job. It's a huge region in inland California composed of the state, essentially the state, or the county of Riverside and the county of San Bernardino. And Jason, to give you an idea how large this is, we have about 5 million people in population, and our combined area is larger than 10 states in the union. Not only that, we are projected to grow 44% in population by the next 20 years. Also, the economy, well, it's no surprise, the economy of California is booming. It's one of the largest in the world, honestly. And although our county is not one of the big in terms of economic output in the state, the county economy is larger than 13 states in the nation. So this is really something very big. We are, as Jason said, a Hispanic service institution. 41% of our students are Hispanic, and 62% of our 25,000 students come from a population and receive student assistance in some form of federal or Pell Grant. So we really serve a usually underrepresented and underserved population. And that has made us something of which we are very proud. So we're not only a Research One university, the only Research One university in the Inland Empire, but we are also very committed to our minority population. And in fact, we have been recognized by our effort, and US and World Report has ranked UCR as #1 in social mobility for the last 3 years. Actually, for all the time that this ranking had existed, UCR has been ranked #1. Now, as rich and prosperous the state of California is, there are disparity between regions, and we are in a region that has suffered over the year, over many, I would say, almost lack of support, if not neglect. So there are issues about health disparity in the region. Climate change is definitely affecting our area, air quality, and so on. There are things that are central and crucial to our everyday life. And we create a lot of economic output. So a study from the Office of the President reported that we generate more than $2.3 billion in economic output in the Inland Empire alone. Now, I want to say, this is great, but as being a large institution, there are a lot of this output that is just generated by employing a lot of people, consuming goods, and so on. what we want is to have a more concrete account of how research expenditure help to this economic growth and economic output in the region. So this is something that IRIS does in a great way, from my opinion and from my past experience. So you can really pinpoint, you know, the job that you create, where students and faculty have been trained under sponsored research grants, where they go to work, which kind of jobs, which industry, where they are located, how they are geographically distributed, and so on. So this is very valuable information. As I say, when you talk to legislators, when you talk to elected officials about the need and the opportunities and the possibility, as well as the challenge of the region, but also when you talk to industry and when you talk to the private sector. So we have started a big effort to increase our economic development activity. And for the last 2 years, we have planning on something that we call OASIS, which stands for Opportunity to Advance Sustainability, Innovation, and Social Inclusion. And it's a combination of infrastructure development and programmatic activity. And the first phase of that is the creation of a clean tech park. And we want to do that because something extraordinary that happened for our region, the relocation of CAR, the California Air Resources Board, to Riverside, next to our campus or in the University of Riverside. We already have a big interaction with CAR, which for those of you who are not from California may not be aware, is a state agency, probably the more involving research state agency in California that is responsible for the regulation that have clearly cleaned the air in Southern California. So you may have heard horror stories about pollution and whatnot. It's hard to believe. When I sit in my office now, I have a great view of the mountain, and people tell me, well, in the 80s, you couldn't see the mountain. This all has changed now in great measure because of the implementation of policy derived from the research taking place and policy making by CAR. And now is in the region. So this is a fantastic opportunity to have research taking place in the region where the effect is more important and where the people that are affected by that research are present. And what is even nicer than to have those people involved in conducting some of that research and economic activities. Development activities. So we're really advocating to, this is our next big project from the Office of Research and Tech Transfer within our campus, and try to capitalize on the synergy we have with CAR and attract companies around clean air, clean energy, also health disparity, agriculture, smart agriculture to the region, which are areas where we have a lot of talent, but also will benefit the region. But also, very importantly, in this, we need to demonstrate the potential. We need to demonstrate, we need to show what is the potential return on investment. So when you go and talk to corporations, with companies that want to relocate in the area, you need to be able to show what you have now, what are your challenges, what are your opportunities, and for that we need data. And the data that IRIS can provide is a big asset in that regard. So Jason, I give the floor back to you.
2 years, he says, as he comes off mute again. Thanks so much, Rodolfo. So there are a lot of great themes there that I want to explore a little bit, and I also want to offer opportunities for our audience members to put questions in chat. So what I'm hearing there is both the really serious interest in communicating how research done on a campus and funded externally has both immediate and sort of medium and long-term impact. And so IRIS, as we think about that, immediate impact is something like when CAR, if it is a state granting agency, makes a grant for research on clean air to your campus, right? Part of what we see and can tell you about is what businesses in the state are supporting that work. Our vendors are providing goods and services that are purchased off of those contracts. And we can also tell you features of those businesses, what industries they're in, something about their ownership structure, minority owned, women owned, size, age, things of that nature. And so in the immediate terms, sort of thinking about the ways in which having an institution like yours, anchored in the Inland Empire where it is and doing the kind of research it does, supports a broader ecosystem of companies and nonprofits and other organizations. In the medium term, I think you've pointed to this, a huge part of what research does is serve as an important part of the education of students. One of the things we've learned from IRIS data that I don't think we knew fully before is just how many undergraduates, in addition to doctoral students and master's students, are deeply involved in and paid RAs on externally funded research at different time points. And so they're thinking about the ways in which what my higher education colleagues might call the high impact kinds of research experiences in the context of a university like yours help students move out into different sorts of jobs. Gives us medium-term impact. And of course, there's the technologies and the discoveries, the findings, the knowledge themselves that are developed through the research process and that have a larger impact on society. And so I think what's really interesting is to think about the ways in which, as an institution, telling, if you will, the whole story, not just about what we spend on research, which is how we often frame it in my institution. We spent X amount, which is great. It's a great number. But what that spending does with and for whom and on what time frames is a really interesting and important way to think about this. And so I wondered if I could have you talk a little bit in that vein. You've talked very much about the sort of long and near-term stuff. How do you see information about your students' participation in research or your faculty's growth as scholars being important, particularly to your all's mission?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I appreciate what you mentioned about students. So, and really, we at the research university, we tend to think of great discovery, great scholarly work, which of course involve graduate student all the time and PhD student. That's the essence of a Research One university. But there is all this involvement in research by undergraduates. And now we're seeing more and more, not only on research, but on entrepreneurial activity. So we have trained in the last 5 years, 7,000 students, most of which are undergraduate, in entrepreneurial and activities. And this has been possible through grants from NSF. We have been part, and we are part of the I-Corp program opportunities grant from EDA awards. We have created an incubator. We have now the first well lab incubator in the Inland Empire. And you can see in the student the desire to participate in activities that go beyond the training. Well, we train them well, we give them enough research lab experience so they can go to graduate school, be successful there, get a PhD. This is a different path. This is a student that want to be the owner of their own companies. They want to be innovator in their own space. They want to be creative, not necessarily think about going to graduate school. So I think understanding better this population, for example, in our region, we do know that many of our graduates remain in the area. They like this where they live. They become in love with the region if they're not from here. When they come to the university, is for California standard, much more affordable place to live than the coast. However, we have hundreds of thousands, and I used to know the exact number, but it keeps on growing, so I don't know, I don't have it in my head, but it's in the hundreds of thousands of people that commute daily from this region in look of the technology and high-paying jobs that are in other parts of the state. and they don't happen here, right? So in a way, we produce all the students, we produce all the talent, but then they live in the area, but they commute. So I always joke about this, but it's not really a joke. If we want to improve the air quality, the first thing we need to do is to create jobs for these students so that they don't need to commute. They stay here and where they live. So having information about which kind of industries these students end up working in, their incomes, their their diversity, their location, all these factors help us plan and offer. When we're talking, we are trying to attract companies to the region, say, here, you have all this workforce here ready to be, ready for you to start working in your company. And that's a big asset that we contribute, in addition to all the great research we do. The human capital we really and talented human capital we produce at the university. And I think you're right. I think we don't need to think only on the graduate school level of the master and PhD, but really even at the undergraduate level, there are great opportunity for our students, and having data that help in that regard. As I say earlier, it's very convincing. I have seen the effect on people when you show some of your maps and how this data become much more real than saying, oh, we generate so many billions of dollars in the economy, or we have so many millions of dollars in research expenses. That's a great measure. We do understand what that means internally to the university, but when you talk to external partner, external stakeholder, it doesn't have the same impact and meaning that it has for us internal to the university.
Great. Yeah, that's, I mean, I love the idea. One of the things that I always find myself saying is we have to remember when we're talking about this, that research is also teaching, right? And it's a particular type of teaching that can really help students, not just those who go on to grad school, but those who want to follow many different types of careers. And so understanding that is great. I think this also points to one of the other interesting features that is part of IRIS. And as we start to segue toward thinking about the strength of aggregation, I want to not get there just yet because I want to pause for questions. But as we start to think about that, another way to think about this is when a university like yours joins IRIS, part of what happens is that your researchers and affiliates, right, your students, graduate students and others, faculty, can access the research data through our virtual data enclave and use it for their projects. In fact, it's also possible for IR, the institutional research or other analytic staff to access your data that we improve. And so part of this is not just about being able to use data that we produce for questions you need. It's being able to use data to answer new questions. And so be really interested to hear your thoughts on, frankly, the kinds of things you wish you were able to answer questions about in your role that you can't currently. Because that's, I think, the strength of having an academic organization as the anchor of this kind of consortium, is that it opens possibilities to address questions that we didn't design initially, but that come from our member institutions and the research community.
Yeah, as you know, my background is in mathematics, so I really love data, but I'm not as much as sometimes I wish I would have more training on that. I'm not a social scientist, but I'm fascinated by the abundance of data that we have now. And also something that I find it very interesting is the combination of this data with geographical data, how this data is distributed, right? And how we can overimpose on maps different level of information, right? And so there are all kinds of questions that come to my mind. Again, I'm not a social scientist, but I think this is a great opportunity for our colleagues in those areas. to look about how certain economic parameters affect other aspects of our life. Even I recently read an article from a colleague about, about our, political views or biases or openness about certain things and so on. How this is related to other activities, what we do. Of course, we all know that, things may be correlated and they not be the cause of what is happening. But I think it's very interesting to investigate this relationship. And also I think when it comes to, and I think we will get to that a little more deep, when we talk about minority serving institution, and a lot of interest, and rightfully so, in the nation to be more inclusive, to diversify the workforce, especially in STEM disciplines. I think there is a role, a very particular role for institutions like us that are both highly research active and minority serving institutions. So I always say, right, in a way, and I don't say this with any disrespect for any institution that is a minority serving institution, in particular our, but in certain region of the country, you have to be a minority serving institution. If you do things reasonably, given by the demographic of where you are. So in a location where 50% of the population is Hispanic, you have to be a Hispanic serving institution. So now, what are you going to do with that, right? How are you going to make sure that you take advantage of that demographic and use it to achieve more inclusiveness in all aspects of our society, right? So I think we have an opportunity that other institutions don't have, because they don't have that demographic. And as institutions become more and more reliant on their local student, it's clearly there are some that are going to be more prosperous in terms of diversity than others. But I think what is very important is to not take that for granted and be satisfied with that, but use data about that to contribute to other aspects of society. And there is where I think there's a big role for the social sciences, for the humanities too, right? So that, and I hope I'm not deviating too much, but me, when I start talking, I'm gonna get to some of this topic. And it's a great opportunity to promote all the research we do in terms of technology and many things, but it's also a great time to use data to move forward our sense that hopefully growing and growing this country for correcting inequality, correctly neglect in economic terms, correcting, being more inclusive, so that all get to benefit from the prosperity of the economy in a state like California, but also the nation, and hopefully inspire others to do the same.
That's great. I mean, I think that's a great segue to starting to think about what the benefits of data aggregation across multiple institutions might be. But before I pick that up and run with it, because Rodolfo, I get excited about that too. I want to pause for a second and see if there are questions or reactions from members of the audience as we sort of segue a little bit from, why would UC Riverside benefit from participating, to how can having many institutions of many different types help us address larger questions like those that Rodolfo was raising about diversity and inclusion in, say, the STEM workforce. I think that really sort of starts to get to some of the benefits, not just of individual institutions participating, but of really digging into sort of fully representing the higher education research landscape. So Dan, you said you have a question there?
There's one question so far from John Barnhart. He says, Jason, your previous point about in what time frame is very interesting. Can IRIS help track the time it takes for investments in research to generate a return, realizing that return is super subjective, but curious if we can make explicit connections between investments today and returns in 2 to 3 years?
So that's it's a great question. That is something that we are actively doing. It's an area of active research using the IRIS data. So one of the things that these data are incredibly valuable for, so Rodolfo recently just cited the economic impact analysis. Often those economic impact analyses, which are very good, are based on multipliers, right? It's hard to see what the individual projects or individual flows of resources and ideas and people are that have an impact in the world, right? And so what these data allow us to do, and I'll give you an example or two as we think about it, is understand how when, say, a grant, imagine one of your faculty or yourself gets $1 million grant to do something, right? You use that money basically for two purposes, three if you count indirect costs. But the two purposes are to hire people and to buy the stuff necessary to do the research, right? And the stuff could be services, could be goods. So the kinds of things that you could think about doing here, it is very hard at this point with these data to track out, the 20 or 30 years it often takes for an innovative new technology to really manifest itself. But it is, because of our ability to think about the careers of individuals, possible to see both the near-term economic impact of being associated with the university for vendors. So we look at that in terms of statistical models of jobs and job growth, but also in terms of stories about, the small engineering company, this is actually one, who produced the infant-sized treadmills that a kinesiology professor used in NIH-funded research to demonstrate that giving an infant with Down syndrome 8 to 12 minutes a day of exercise helps them walk 4 to 6 months faster. It's a huge developmental finding, but part of the story that is not often told is the story about this little company that worked with the faculty member to develop the prototype treadmill and then developed a product line selling those treadmills to hospitals around the country who loan or rent them to families so that the families can provide their children with this kind of exercise. So you can tell those kinds of stories and you can see them statistically in the immediate term. We're also starting to see longer term effects as people trained in research move out into the economy and get jobs. We've studied that most explicitly, and this is to Rodolfo's point, in entrepreneurial areas, and by thinking about the extent to which particularly graduate students end up working for high technology firms and end up doing work where, as an employee of a firm, they patent an innovation that is related to the work that was done in their dissertation. Right? So it's through tracing those kinds of flows of people and ideas that we think you're able to see these things, and really to be able to get into some of the policy levers that might help with making decisions about them. So Rodolfo, do you have thoughts about?
No, I think you're right. So, as the person asking the question say, it's very, very broad what impact mean, right? I mean, how we measure that in many different ways. So there's, of course, a very, very long-term impact of research based on all the basic research we do at the university that is mostly driven by the search of knowledge and sometimes even curiosity, right? That it takes decades sometimes to move through the more applied and then translational research until we see the content. But we see every day, we vaccines, right? Who would have thought that in such a short period of time, vaccine for COVID would have been already available? But that is based on tremendous amount of decades of basic research in many areas. We discover new galaxies, we discover black holes based on fundamental research in physics and mathematics that originally is far from any reality, but eventually lead to this discovery. So materials, right? We create material with outstanding properties that it's hard to imagine, and started with someone looking at sometimes even in nature and say, oh, look what's happening here. Can we fabricate? Can we make something of that? Now, many of these things have a more immediate application, and they will have more if we commit ourselves to to do more of that on the university level. Of course, this is just my opinion, and others may have different one. I don't think we have really over the year, at least in some institutions, fully value the translational aspect of research as much as we value the basic research. Don't get me wrong. As I say, I'm a mathematician. I've been to Washington many times to advocate for basic research, and I will continue to do so. But there's no reason that tell us that we shouldn't focus also on what is translation. And the translation is done better by small companies or large companies, but it's done by faculty that and students that get interested in going into that entrepreneurial work and pursue a career, which is a little different from the typical scientific or scholarly work that we have done for centuries, for millennia in academia. And I think it's time for universities to embrace that more. Not that we are not doing it, but I think it's time to recognize the effort of faculty in those areas and in those efforts, as well as we recognize other activities. So that is sometimes very long term, but there are some things that can have a much shorter impact if we advocate our effort to that. And the other thing you mentioned, student, right? I mean, that is invaluable, right? That some of that is immediate, right? You train a student in lab, you train a student in research, you train a student in scholarly work, and it's immediately more qualified for all kinds of jobs, right? And that what it adds to the life, and there's a lot of study on this, how this benefits the student is invaluable. So there are things that are immediate research, immediate impact from what we do, and there are things, as you also mentioned, that take a longer period, right, to materialize.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the really exciting things, and you pointed to it, as did the person who asked the question, which is to think about the various ways in which impact happens, right? And so one of the things I think that's potentially really powerful, and that you alluded to when you talked about the sort of interesting position, unique position of being a very research intensive and minority serving institution. One of the things that we know about research and efforts to try to increase equity and inclusiveness and diversity in STEM, right, is the really important role that minority serving institutions play in training undergraduates who may go on to PhD programs, even if they don't do PhD work themselves. And one of the challenges I think that we've faced, both for that and for thinking about these kinds of economic impact stories, is that for single institutions, it is often very, very difficult to do analyses on small numbers, right? And sadly, part of the challenge is that the numbers of people in some fields from underrepresented backgrounds are small enough that we really have trouble saying, how can we improve work and outcomes, right? By the same token, for certain sorts of impact, right, the beyond that of people, what we're looking for are the conditions under which rare and important events happen, right? And in both those cases, there's value for research purposes and for explanatory purposes in aggregation, and having lots of data from different sources so that you can study responsibly and protect the identities of small groups of individuals. There's also benefits in aggregation in the sense that increasingly work in universities, in colleges, in economic development is, as you suggested, collaborative, right? And that we need to have information to tell the full story, not just about one campus, but about groups of campuses, right? So it might be all of the UC campuses in Southern California that are working together, or it might be all of the schools in a particular city or region. For instance, I make it up, Atlanta. Or it might be all of a certain sort of school. I was really taken by the idea of translation here and thinking about the varieties of it. So one of the ways we've been talking recently, just off a series of presentations by a group of staff people at USDA, is in thinking about agriculture and agricultural extension and the role of the land grant institutions, all the various cohorts, including the 1890s, in a particular type of translation that we don't measure elsewhere. And so all of these are reasons to aggregate. I wonder in that frame, and I see we have a question that I'll get to in a second, but I wonder, Rodolfo, if when you think about Riverside's impact, right, how you think about representing the collaborative role, right, and the partnerships that are a part of that.
Yeah, so, we are not the only one. Certainly, 5 other, or 5, I think 2 more are becoming Hispanic serving institution within the UC system, right? And then we also have all the Cal State schools, even the community college. So I think showing the aggregated value of this show that it's not a one-off thing, it's not an outlier what happened with one university and one region, but it showed the full potential, right? And sometimes we tend to think that the problem is always with the pipeline, and that we are not more diverse because the pipeline is very small, or there are leaks in the pipeline, which are all, valid consideration and to some extent are true, but it's not the only reason. I think there is more potential for representation from different underrepresented groups if we broaden up their inclusion and we work together, right? I think we have all to learn from each other, and I think aggregating information about what some of the institutions bring and produce, I think can be very convincing to, I don't think we need to do much to convince people that diversity is something very important that from which we all benefit and that is so needed for research, right? Have people from different backgrounds, for different culture, from different perspective on life, so much enrichment, it brings to the research enterprise something that we cannot do. Not to mention that there's not enough people for all what we need to do in research. So, I hope others will think, and I want to say in this regard, if an institution was a star metric participant, as we were in Kansas, it's very easy to adapt to be a member IRIS in terms of the collection of data and information. If you're not, I want to be honest, there is some work involved, but it's totally worth it. I think that, and I'm not getting any special deal, I want to clarify that. I don't get a commission for attracting other members, but I think that and I've seen the numbers, and Jason, you can talk about the combined return or impact of all the members of IRIS, but imagine if we have 90% of the institution together on this, it will blow our mind. It's something that we know, all of us who are at research university, we know the impact that research has, but put it in numbers so that no representative can avoid looking at it and say, hey, this is a fantastic industry. This produces the wealth that we're trying to generate in our population. It could be so convincing.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions. So I want to run through these pretty quickly. One, I think this one's for Rodolfo. It says, from Vernon Ross, America Competes 2022 targets research capacity funding to universities that receive less than $50 million in federal R&D funding. How do you navigate being both an R1 and an MSI?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I can say a lot about UCR, and in fact I have no merit on that because I came when this was already a fantastic research one and minority institution, and in fact that was one of the reasons that, in addition to be so fortunate that they hired me, that I came to this university, because I was attracted by that peculiar feature that and again, it's not only a minority serving institution just because we feel we check a percentage of our students of certain ethnicity. We are really committed to those students, as we are to all our students. But we want to make sure that everybody has the same opportunity. And in fact, there's no graduation gap, rotation gap in our university, independent of race, ethnicity, and so on. So it's not easy, I think, because there is this perception that research one university are less diverse, which is true, but and then minority serving institutions are more focused on undergraduate education and maybe no so research active university. As I say, in the California system, we have several counter examples of that. And I think when you realize that you can do both things, that you don't need to focus on research, and in fact, you cannot focus on research without being more inclusive. It's just become something that it's part of what your mission. If you read the mission of all especially your public university, if you read your mission, you will see these two things combined in different wording and in different forms. So it's just being faithful to our mission. And then I think a very important component is hiring and retaining and encouraging and supporting faculty and staff who support this mission and believe in this mission to being inclusive while at the same time being excellent. And they are not two competing or different aspects, they are two sides of the same thing.
So there's also kind of a data-ish question here from Lou Lefton, bringing this back to the MSI research impact theme. Given that so few MSIs are in IRIS, can we infer their research impact, for example, using subawards to HBCUs, et cetera, from R1s? Oh, maybe Jason would.
So let me start by saying we hope that UCR is just the first institution to join us. Part of what we're hoping to do, and I think the comment after that in chat points at this, is build some of the data that can help us demonstrate how research excellence is achieved with a very diverse student and faculty body, or a more diverse student and faculty body than many R1 institutions have. So yes, I think aside from the fact that our IRIS is still growing and our goal is to bring in more institutions of a wider range of foci, I think there are creative ways to think about understanding the impact of groups of institutions. And so one thing that's recently been done is a pilot project with the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, where we've linked data from UMetrics, the data IRIS produces, to the survey of earned doctorates. And that allows for people, there've actually been some courses taught around this, that allows for people to come in and within the context of the full population of doctoral recipients from all campuses, right, understand some of their undergraduate background, and from the UMetrics data, some of the specifics of their research training. What kinds of teams are they working on? Kinds of sizes of teams and compositions. And then the goal there would be to add in the additional data about, say, career outcomes. So in addition to thinking about the fact that many institutions, certainly in Michigan, this is the case, the very large institutions in a state often partner with and subcontract to some of the less research intensive institutions in the state, and we can see that and start to think about effects. There are also ways in which you can see, with judicious responsible data linkage for statistical purposes, transitions that people make across different types of institutions, with an eye toward understanding, how do we build and sustain a research infrastructure and research ecosystem that really does do justice to the population of the country. And I think part of what's important there, and what I want to kick it to Rodolfo to think about Teresa's comment. But part of what's important there is realizing that there's massive evidence from the science of science and growing evidence that diverse teams of scientists and diverse researchers produce higher impact science. There's also evidence that the people who make teams diverse tend to have worse career outcomes, right? And that paradox of diversity, right? Collectively, we get better discoveries from having a diverse workforce, but we're not right now doing our best job in protecting and sustaining the people who make the workforce diverse, right? That's a really important sort of question that could be addressed with these sorts of data. Thanks. So Rodolfo, I don't know if you saw it, but Teresa Maldonado said UCR as an MSI, HSI, and as an R1 has an opportunity to demonstrate how research excellence is achieved with the 21st century demographic. So UCR can dispel the perception that research excellence is not done at MSIs. And I think you were pointing to that in your response, but I wanted to flag it as a really interesting point for thinking about these kinds of.
And I want to thank Teresa. Some of you may not know she's the vice president for research of the whole system, and so I kind of become shy when I saw that she was a participant. I appreciate her support as always, and her vision also about what she just said. Right, there is no. I think it reemphasizes something we have been commenting already. There's no this notion that we need to focus on one thing or the other. I don't believe on that, and we don't believe on that excellence in research and diversity are two competing or exclusive things. On the contrary, the diversity lead to even better and more prosperous research and in other aspects of our activities, right? So, and I think it helped also. First of all, it's a reality, and Teresa mentioned it, that's the demography of the 21st century. So, but also, I think it will contribute. I mean, there's always a feedback on this, right? And the more diverse we become, the more people from different backgrounds can see themselves representing and imagine that they could be many different things in life, which is harder for many students, especially coming from very humble backgrounds, if they don't see people that have the same experience, they don't see people that look at them, they don't see people that have gone through the same step in life that they had to go. It's very hard for them to imagine that they could be X, Y, or Z in their path. They don't see where in their heads ever, and certainly this is very far from reality, right? And we need to keep on promoting all our students to be all what they can be, and there's a big role for again, this is done at minority-driven institutions, but again, we shouldn't assume that that's their role to train only these minorities. It's just that we have, as I say earlier, we have the opportunity to be diverse that other, because of demographic, and I know many institutions put a lot of effort in increasing their diversity, and they not succeed because most of their students are local from their state where the demographic doesn't favor diversity. But in places where it is, now we have, if you want, we have an advantage over other state or region, and I feel we have even a bigger responsibility to promote this diversity.
That's great, and I think it raises the really interesting set of questions that we don't have answers yet for, but which, having good data and having accessible data and well-documented data and representative data offers all kinds of possibilities for thinking about how we better understand exactly those processes and where we as a sector, higher education, the research infrastructure of basic science, fundamental science, translational science, can figure out what we need to do to take the right steps in these directions. And I think that's part of the promise of engaging, in community, I want to reiterate that Rodolfo, was an elected member of the board of IRIS from Kansas. We're actually governed by our member institutions. This is a university-owned and operated research organization that also does the reporting and engagement. And much of what we do is driven by the interests of our participating institutions, right? And so another thing that I'm really excited about in this conversation is that thinking in these terms and thinking with new partners opens all kinds of questions that may not have occurred to our current partners or data users. And so that's another reason to think about the ways in which we can build community around these really important questions. So Dan, I know we're coming to the end of our time here, I believe.
Yeah, we're running up against the end. I don't think there are any further questions unless we get a couple real quick, but I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us, and we'll be posting a recording of the session in a day or so.
And Rodolfo, I wanted to thank you once again for your support and for joining us for this really, really interesting conversation. And I wanted to give you a chance to have the last word. If there were, thoughts or reflections on the conversation or things you wish you'd said that you didn't, please take it away.
No, probably there are things that then I will regret I say, but
well, we wouldn't want that.
No, I don't. And thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the attendees to come into the webinar. And I think we all, I suspect that we are mostly or probably all from academia. And again, we don't need to convince ourselves of what we do and the value, but I think we are living in a time that is very, very important that we demonstrate to the public in very concrete terms, in things that they can really grasp, both the public and elected officials, the relevance of all the research that is being done at our institutions. And I think I know we never took it for granted, but I think more than ever now we need to make it evident in an undisputed way that our contribution to society is tremendous. And so that if the public value this, then of course our elected official will value it too, right? So, and thank you again for the chance. Looking forward to become again a member of IRIS.